fascista, ma in verità tutta la scuola erano antifascisti. Comunque molte grazie davvero.
Franco, ¿te quieres sentar acá? Yo me siento aquí.
Y tengo solamente que conectar porque tengo una presentación en
Sí,
PowerPoint.
te la puedes
Sí,
pasar.
sí, sí, sí.
¿O te quieres sentar tú? No.
Gerardo y la doctora Elde García.
No, pero no soy doctora, tú lo sabes muy bien. Ojalá. Ya, eso.
Perfecto. Y cuando empiece, bueno, cuando
Ya
alguien
que
quiera
pronto,
preguntar,
ahora sí, Laura. Sí, la candidatura es una
Gracias.
Sí. Sí. No, ahora ya. Ahora sí estoy casi.
Cuando la tengas, me la mandas.
Sí, claro, la tesis, sí. Incluso alguien me escribió de algún lado, pero es que estaban así, no, estaba con tantas cosas, entonces no contesté, pero alguien me pidió la tesis, dije, ojalá lo tuviera ya para ya enviárselas.
Y es muy poco.
se necesitan ahorita.
Pero si ya llevo todo el año
Con la caloría.
Acumulando la caloría.
No, pero tú nadas, ¿no, Joel?
Pero acabo de regresar después de 4 semanas, cabrón.
No importa, ya te dejarás de esas calorías.
Ya no tosí sin meterme tantas. No, nomás me
Gerardo García Rojas.
Está para Pues sí, tal cual.
sí, no,
¿De dónde vino? No pongo nada más el no. Ponga, a ver.
Soy común.
Sí, es que bastante.
Pero, ¿y tú?
Ya nos están viendo en YouTube. Ahí estamos nosotros.
¿Te la mando?
Pero no entendí cuál es porque mira, estoy saludando.
Ah, sí, perfecto.
Está retrasado.
Es su candidata, doctor. Sí, muy bien.
¿Y a qué estás inscrita ahí en el dicho en el de historia de la ciencia?
Sí, de hecho soy la coordinadora ahora del programa.
¿Cuántos son ahí?
Sí, tengo una presentación en PowerPoint.
O sea, Giovanni, Angélica.
Claro que sí, solo que no tengo la
la
memoria USB.
Pau.
Gracias.
Yo tengo una memoria USB. Si
Ah,
quieres.
perfecto.
¿Yo también tienes una?
Ahora es.
Ya la traen. Paula, Giovanni, Gisela, Angélica y yo. O sea, bueno, está también Sergio Nicolai.
¿Y cuántos más hay? ¿Cuántos departamentos hay?
Es que son programas de investigación. Son como 10.
Muchas gracias.
Es que han surgido nuevos, que la verdad es que ya te les perdí cómo se llaman.
Ya son bastantes.
Sí.
Cada uno de esos tiene más.
No, hay unos más grandes. Sí, pues depende mucho. Antes que nosotros estaban ahí fácil, hola, pero pues ya no cambiando el asunto. Sí, ¿cómo ves? Oye, ahora te ves más grande con tu bigote.
Gracias.
Ya yo, ay sí.
¿Tienes un sobrino, primo que le dicen Yayo?
Mi tío, es mi tío. Sí, Yayo.
Gracias.
Te quiero mucho y voy a ver ahora en Navidad.
¿Es de San Luis?
Sí, es de Matehuala. Sí, de Matehuala, San Luis Potosí, pero él vive en Saltillo hace ya muchos años.
¿Y toda tu familia es de San Luis entonces?
Sí, de ahí de Matehuala. Ya viven, allá voy a ir a pasar la Navidad porque hace rato que no las veo. Ah, sí, qué bien. Pero tú vas a la mera capital, ¿no?
Sí, bueno, no sé, lo estoy planeando todavía.
Y San Luis es que todo el estado es muy bonito, la verdad, no es por nada, pero y muy diverso. O sea, es muy diferente. De donde yo soy es la zona semiárida, entonces es el semidesierto y está Real de 14, Wirikuta. Y luego está la zona media, que es muy bonita, que tiene también la media luna. Digo, ahorita hace frío, y bueno, pero es este lugar espectacular que...
O sea, si en un viaje se puede visitar.
No, sí está.
Sí tienes que ir.
Sí, tienes que ir. Y la Huasteca, que es preciosa. Y la Huasteca, pues, tiene varios lugares. O sea, la parte de naturaleza, la parte de Gilitla, donde está el castillo de Sir Edward James, el castillo surrealista, y una casa que hicieron casa, museo, hotel de Leonora Carrington.
Ah, ya.
Sí. porque andaba por ahí. Entonces, pero bien lindo, me gusta mucho. Aunque hace mucho que no voy. Bueno, es que sí, hace mucho que no voy. Y la capital también tiene su encanto, entonces también. O sea, tiene muchos museos, está bonita.
Pero no, o sea, no, es que nunca he ido, entonces como que estaba pensando como
O sea, a la capital y algún otro lado te alcanza, pero por ejemplo,
A los
quizá lo
tres,
más
¿no?
cerca, no, a las 3, 4 zonas no.
ya.
O sea, pues es que depende. Bueno, a lo mejor sí lo
Pero
haces.
a lo mejor es como de la capital y de la capital desplazarse a las otras.
Sí, es que, o sea, digamos, a la Huasteca también puedes desde acá, pero es por la salida a Ixmiquilpan y luego, o sea, digamos, Pachuca, Ixmiquilpan y luego todo, Jojutla, más bien Huejutla, y es muy bonito, pero son curvas.
Muchas
curvas,
gracias.
curvas.
Aquí lo comparto ya.
O sea, vale mucho la pena. O la otra es por la, que también me he ido, pero también son curvas por, como que llegas a Peña de Bernal y te metes a la Sierra Gorda.
Ah, ya.
Y eso también es muy bonito, pero también es, lleva sus
Entonces,
horas,
el
¿eh?
clima es
Sí,
muy,
también, sí, peligrosón, ¿eh? Porque las curvas.
neblinado, no sé cómo se diga.
Sí, neblinoso, entonces sí, no. O sea, porque vas ahora en estas vacaciones.
Sí, bueno, en Año Nuevo pensaba ir. A ver, ¿qué tal?
Pero, ¿y si estamos aquí, verdad? Es que ya no entiendo, nos vamos a ver.
No sé, no sé.
Sí, aquí está la.
La cámara.
Porque no sé si ponerme en pie.
Ah, tú vas a sí, ese es mejor.
No.
Sí.
Pero el problema es con la cámara, es un problema si hablo en frente del.
Pues es que la tiene que estar moviendo, ahí no se pregunta.
Tú vas a Europa ya.
Sí.
No es un problema si me pongo cámara.
Ah, ahí sí. Entonces ahí sí.
Ah,
ya
sí,
estás.
sí.
Ahí sí. O sea, si tú te levantas, ahí sí a nosotros no te están moviendo la cámara.
Ok, entonces es posible mover la cámara. Ah, claro.
Sí.
Sí, porque no te digo, la sí,
¿Y de dove sei dell'Italia?
Torino. Sí, pero vivo a Bruselas. en Belgio.
Y hoy vas a hablar en inglés.
Y sí, porque mi español no me permite lamentablemente de presentar en español, pero comprendo bastante, entiendo bastante bien.
Ok, sí, porque yo hablo en español.
Sí, no, eso no es un problema, es hablar.
Sí,
Entender es más fácil que hablar
sí.
en un idioma.
Ya.
Sí. Hola, vas a preparar allá para el otro. Ah, va. Vale, gracias, Rani.
¿Qué significa el K de la universidad?
Es Catholic Universidad,
Católica.
pero no hay nada de católico, pero es la primera universidad fundada en Bélgica. Y entonces fue muy importante por los estudios teológicos.
Ah, claro.
Y hay el nombre.
Todavía hay cátedras.
Sí, hay.
Hola, 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 ¿qué tal? Hola, hola. Bueno, ¿sí me escuchas? Bueno, sí, ya. ¿Me escuchas, Reni? ¿No?
Sí,
No, está bien.
sí, sí.
No, ok.
Ah, no, sí, ya.
¿Ya? Ya, porque ya activé el audio desde aquí.
Sí, ya. Ya está. Se tardó. Sí, está bien. Sí, ya te he presentado. Ya, cuando él tenga el acceso a este micrófono ya están activos.
Y entonces, si me pongo...
Sí, sí, sí.
Tomo el micrófono.
Sí.
Vale, vale.
¿Sí?
Sí, sí.
Javi.
Mucha gente está chiquito y está
Laura.
Laura. Laura, ¿ya?
Pues yo creo que sí. Ya está bien.
Sí, ya estoy aquí.
Bueno, pues.
Sí.
1, 2, 3.
Muchas gracias a todas y todos por estar acá en el evento que vamos a transmitir de manera virtual simultáneamente. Contamos hoy con la participación, la presencia más bien de Franco Orlandi, historiador y doctorante de la Universidad de Leuven o Lovaina, no sé, sí, en Bruselas y de Torino, en Italia, que nos presentará parte de su investigación doctoral, que también ya ha sido presentada en forma de artículos, en torno a lo que él ha llamado el legado de Cesare Lombroso, el antropólogo criminal, en América Latina, a partir de dos personajes, Israel Castellanos y Leonidio Ribeiro. Franco nos visita como parte del proyecto de Psychomove, un proyecto integrado principalmente por museos y universidades de Europa y América Latina, en el que el DIE tiene presencia a través de la doctora Laura Cházaro. Al reunir diferentes países, este proyecto permite una suerte de encuentro multilingüístico entre sus y digo esto porque si bien Franco, en mi opinión, domina muy bien el español, nos comunicó que prefería hacerlo en inglés para mayor comunidad. Y bueno, y posteriormente la maestra Aidel López, perdón, García, investigadora del
Es mi
CEICH,
tocaya, no pasa nada.
nos acompañará con algunos comentarios al respecto, en francés o en español.
En español,
Español,
Sí,
sí, en español, sí.
Ah, bueno. Entonces, bueno, te doy la palabra, Franco.
Sí, sí, muchísimas gracias. Es un verdadero honor estar aquí hoy. Y antes de comenzar, quiero realmente agradecer Laura por organizar esta conferencia, Aide por aceptar comentar mi texto y Gerardo por moderar la sesión y por ser mi guía esas semanas en Ciudad de México. Y sí, lamentablemente mi español no me permite de presentar en español, lo tengo que presentar en inglés, pero si hay algo que no está claro, no duden en interrumpirme en cualquier momento. Entonces, podemos empezar. Pongo en pie una presentación más dinámica. Muy bien, entonces, ahora hablo en inglés. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. So as Gerardo just said, the goal of my presentation is to shed light on the scientific legacy of Cesare Lombroso in Latin America by following the trajectories of two scholars. It's not working. It's not, yeah. Okay, now it's working. Thank you very much. So these two very popular and famous criminologists, Latin American criminologists, Israel Castellanos from Cuba and Leonidio Ribeiro from Brazil. And this is how my presentation is going to be divided. I will start by giving you a very general introduction on the figure of Cesare Lombroso and criminal anthropology. I will then spend a few words on the relationship between the Lombrosian school and Mexico, which I think is very interesting. I will then very briefly tell you something about the history of the Lombroso Prize, because Israel Castellanos and Leonidio Ribeiro were both awarded the Lombroso Prize for the best work in criminal anthropology. And then I will dive into the scientific careers of these two scientists, Castellanos and Ribeiro. And finally, I will try to draw some conclusions. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, thank you. Sí, gracias. Sí, mejor. Muchas gracias. So, Cesare Lombroso, let's start with the very basics. So, Cesare Lombroso was an Italian scientist. He was a university professor in Italy. He taught forensic medicine and psychiatry at the University of Turin, the city where I'm from. And he was by far the most famous Italian scientist and the most influential Italian scientist of the 19th century. And he's considered to be the founding father of criminal anthropology, which is a sort of early branch of criminology. And Lombroso was one of the first scientists to realize that crime and criminals could be studied in a scientific way. And he was also one of the first to emphasize the importance of the criminal as an individual rather than crime as a general and abstract phenomenon. And Lombroso is very famous for his theory of a born criminal, which I will explain now. Thank you. So, criminal anthropology, the main idea of Lombroso is that criminal behavior is the result of a biological predisposition that leaves visible traces on the body. So the idea is that criminals, here in this slide, you can see a picture of a typical criminal, exhibit a higher percentage of physical anomalies compared to normal people, to law-abiding citizens. For example, a normal shape of a skull, the presence of tattoos. The list is very long, but the idea is that, of course, the criminal man is different from the normal man. And how did Lombroso explain criminality? He explained criminality in terms of a regression on the evolutionary scale. And this is very important. We will see how this theory was applied to Latin America. So the idea is that the criminal man is not a normal person. He's at the bottom of an evolutionary ladder. He's a sort of primitive man that live in modern society. And this explains why criminals are violent and they don't have a moral sense, etc. So Lombroso put his key ideas into L'Uomo Delinquente, The Criminal Man, which had 5 editions and which I think is the most famous criminological treatise ever written. The influence of this book was terrific all over the world. It was widely read in Asia, Latin America, Europe, so very important. And here you can see in this picture some drawings taken from this book, where you can see some types of criminals, because of course, the criminals can be subdivided into categories, but I will not talk about this now. So over the last 20 years, there's been a veritable explosion of studies on Lombroso, more than 1,400 studies. However, his legacy, scientific legacy, is still very controversial. And to summarize, just to tell you where I try to fill the gap in this historiography, there are a lot of studies on Lombroso when Lombroso was alive, but we don't know much about what happens when Lombroso dies. We don't know what happens to his school, and that's what I'm trying to investigate. What happens to the Lombrosian school after the death of Lombroso, which is a very sensitive topic because there is a whole discussion on how much Lombroso inspired totalitarian regimes, the fascist ideology, the Nazi ideology. And so what I'm trying to do is to study what happens to his school after his death. So now, before we talk about Castellanos and Ribeiro, just a few words on the relationship between the Italian school and Mexico. So in this picture, you can see Mario Carrara. Mario Carrara was a disciple of Cesare Lombroso. He was the one who took the chair of forensic medicine in Turin after Lombroso died. And he was also part of the Lombroso family because Mario Carrara married Cesare Lombroso's daughter. And so he was really part of the family. And I consider Carrara to be the scientific hire of Lombroso. So I think it's a very key figure in the history of criminal anthropology. And it's also interesting because in 1932, Mario Carrara was expelled from the University of Turin because he was anti-fascist. In 1931, the fascist state imposed an loyalty oath to all Italian professors. Only 12 professors out of more than 1,000 did not swear. Carrara was one of those, and he was expelled from the University of Turin, which is interesting because Lombroso has this there is this common misconception that see Lombroso as a kind of fascist, but when we look at the history of his school, most of his disciples were anti-fascist, and Mario Carrara is a blatant example of this. So what is interesting is that Carrara loses his chair, and he gets an invitation from the Mexican government, from the Departamento de Prevención Social, for working as a psychiatrist. So this is, I think it's a good testimony of a relationship between these two states. And so this is a letter that he received from Gerardo Daniel, which invites Carrara to go to Mexico. And it's interesting because it says, you will have the opportunity to organize the medical psychiatric service in a very Lombrosian way. So again, this suggests that Lombrosian's legacy was important in Mexico. However, although Carrara accepted the invitation, he never came to Mexico. We don't know why. Probably something happened in Mexico and the offer was not available anymore. So another interesting thing that I discovered recently is that Cesare Lombroso Center for Italian Studies was established in Mexico City in 1921. And Silvio Bonansea was one of the founders of the school, but también Manuel Gamio, the anthropology, which I discovered here in Ciudad de Mexico, is a very important figure. He was one of those that supported the work of Bonansea. Bonansea was an Italian disciple of Lombroso, but he came to Mexico very young. And there is a crazy story that I want to share with you. Something tragic happened to Bonansea. His wife here in Mexico was killed. And Silvio Bonansea sent pictures of the killer to Cesare Lombroso in Italy to get his psychiatric report, which is crazy. And here it's a nice letter because it tells us something about Mexico as well in those years. It says it will be very difficult to establish this center because people here can't barely read Spanish. So having people reading Italian will be very difficult. But that's it. So now, just a few words very shortly on the Lombroso Prize, because as I told you, Castellanos and Ribeiro were both awarded the Lombroso Prize. And this was a prize established after the death of Lombroso by the Lombroso family, in accordance with his last will. So Lombroso asked, please establish a prize in my honor for the best criminal anthropologist. And the prize consisted in some money and also in a bronze plaque. So this is what the Lombroso Prize looked like. It was a plaque of this size. And the money was sponsored by the Lombroso family. And very briefly, these are the three people that decided who's going to win the Lombroso Prize. It was a very small jury and a family business, we can say, because Gina Lombroso was Cesare Lombroso's daughter. Mario Carrara, we already talked about it, was Cesare Lombroso's disciple. And Ruggero Romanese was a disciple of Mario Carrara. And when Mario Carrara leaves the University of Turin, Romanese became the chair, the full professor of forensic medicine. Okay, so what I find personally interesting for my research is that out of 7 editions of the Lombroso Prize, 5 scholars were not Italians. So again, this seems to suggest that Lombroso continued to be important not only in Italy, but also outside the country. And 2 of these scholars were from Latin America, Israel Castellanos and Leonidio Ribeiro. And my interest in these 2 figures is precisely that they were awarded the Lombroso Prize. That's how I started to study them, with the idea that perhaps by following their work, I would learn something about the legacy of Lombroso in Latin America. And what I will try to convince you of today is that indeed, the legacy of Lombroso was very important in the work of these two scientists, or if we want to call them scientists, criminologists, let's say. Okay, so let's start with the first, Israel Castellanos. So Israel Castellanos has a very interesting story. His story is actually the story of an incredible social climbing, because Castellanos was born in a rather poor and humble family. just to give you an idea, his grandfather was one of the many Chinese that came to Cuba in the half of the 19th century to work in the sugar plantations, because there was the abolition of black slavery, but people still needed people to work in the sugar plantation. And his grandfather was one of these Chinese. And the family name Castellanos is actually the name of the owner of a sugar plantation. So Castellanos' grandfather took the family name of the owner. And this is just to give you an idea of how humble the origin of the family was. And Castellanos also had Mexican blood because his grandmother was from Mexico. I don't know from where, but she was Mexican. And there is a text where Castellanos describes his youth, his adolescence, and he kind of portrayed himself as a young man who suffered a lot, who was very poor, he couldn't study, and so he kind of had despair for the future. And one day, this is what he tells us. Of course, it's also a kind of legendary history. One day, something happens in his life, and things change forever for him. And in 1908, Castellanos, there is the onomastico of his father, the birthday name, and his father organizes a party. And at this party, there is a lawyer who starts to talk about the theories of Lombroso. And from that moment, Castellanos realizes that he's very interested in Lombroso and he wants to know more about it. So, don't know. And you can see from these pictures that Castellanos has Asian traits. And this is interesting because despite his Chinese background, Castellanos will consider Chinese as an inferior race. I will talk about this in a second. So here is a quote from this interview that he gave in 1917, where Castellanos describes his life, he's kind of traced his autobiography. And this passage is the passage, very mythical tone, where he realizes that finally he's understanding the theories of Lombroso. And it's very interesting because Castellanos was a self-taught scientist. So he didn't have, at that time, he didn't have a formal education, but nevertheless, he was studying criminal anthropology. And I think that this tells us a lot about what criminal anthropology was, a very amateur science. And people with no education could publish in criminal anthropology and being read by other criminal anthropologists. And that's one of the reasons why criminal anthropology was held in disbelief by many people in Europe at the time, because they said, this is not real science. By the way, in this picture, you can see a very young Castellanos. He should be around 17 years old in this picture, who's making measurements on the body of patients in the psychiatric hospital of Habana. And here it's another picture, same quote from the same interview, a very young Castellanos measuring some skulls. And here you can read that he says, I went to prisons, I studied mentally ill people, I weighted jaws, I measured their bodies. So this is the beginning of Castellanos. And the career that Castellanos had is astonishing because 9 years before graduating, Castellanos was already profesor correspondente in Madrid. He became director. He studied medicine and he graduated in medicine at the University of La Habana. But 2 years before graduating, he was appointed director of the National Institute of Identification by Gerardo Machado. And this is something I would like to stress here, how close Castellanos was to the political power and how criminal anthropology in Brazil and Cuba were strictly related to political power. Castellanos was a very close friend of Machado, and Machado really wanted him to be the director of the National Institute of Identification. So, Machado is considered a leader of an authoritative party. So, this connection that Castellanos had with the political power allowed him to have an incredible career, but he also paid off. It did not really pay off in the end because with the Castro Revolution, he was forced to, his studio was destroyed, and he was forced to leave to the US, and he died in Miami. So let's now move on to an analysis of Castellanos' work, because the first studies of Castellanos aimed at proving that Lombroso is right. the theory of atavism we discussed before, so the idea of evolutionary regression of criminals. Well, Castellanos wanted to prove that Lombroso was right. And he wanted to prove that Lombroso was right by studying Cuban criminals, which was something new at the time. And so this is one of his first studies. And Castellanos claims that he has found a new physical anomaly, a new physical character that proves the theory of atavism. And this character is the boca simiesca, the simian mouth, this one. So in principle, Castellanos thinks that this physical trait can be found in criminals and mentally ill people more frequently than among normal people. But we can already sense the racial implications of criminal anthropology, because of course, these are traits more present, Castellanos says, in Black people. See, yes, so that's the simian lip. Yeah. This is another Latin example. In this study, Castellanos compared, he thinks that he has found a new anomaly. The anomaly is the fact that criminals have a very big jaw, very big jaw. And he does a comparison between the skull of a gorilla and the skull of a Black criminal. Again, the idea is that the theory of atavism is universal, but Castellanos is studying exclusively Black people. And so we can already sense what were the rational implications of his work and how he contributed to criminalizing a part of the population. This is something very important, and this is something that we'll find in Leonidio Ribeiro in Brazil as well. Like this. Yeah, so these are circles. And of course, since Castellanos believed in the existence of born criminals, so people that are born to be criminals, what do we do with them? Castellanos thought that the only solution is death penalty, not only to get rid of criminals, but also to have human remains to study. Because Castellanos complains all the time that he doesn't have skulls, he doesn't have bones for his studies. So he wants criminals to be killed so that he can carry out his research. So there is this thing as well. Okay, this is another study, very interesting when we talk about the criminal anthropology of the inferior races. This is a definition of Castellanos. He believes that this study, which is the only study of Castellanos translated into Italian and published in the Journal of the Lombrosian School, the journal founded by Lombroso. And this is a contribution to the craniometry of Black criminals. And in this study, there are two interesting things. The first thing is that Castellanos compares the skull of Black Afro criminals with the skull of white criminals. And he finds out that white criminals are more monkey looking like than the Black. And his explanation is very racist indeed. The idea is that since Black people are already at the bottom of the evolutionary ladder, they can't regress anymore. But white people, being at the top, they can regress a lot. And so we can see the physical traces of the regression. But the second interesting thing is that Castellanos makes a second comparison. He compares the skull of a Black Afro-Cuban criminal with the skull of a normal Black citizen from Africa, from Congo. And he finds out that the criminal from Cuba is better looking than the African in Africa. And so, if we can move to the next slide, this tells us something about the conception that Castellanos has of race. So, of course, Castellanos, as Lombroso, believe in the existence of races, but race is not an immutable entity. Race can change. And Lombroso also thought that race can change. And so the criminal in Cuba is better than the African in Africa because Cuba is a more civilized country. And so under favorable circumstances, the race can evolve. And this is happening in Cuba too. But it will take a lot of time. And Castellanos is very concerned that Black people can be a huge problem for Cuba. Second thing, as I already told you, among inferior races, criminality is less physically marked. And as I said, it's very interesting that Castellanos, despite his Asian heritage, consider Chinese an inferior race. Although there is a caveat. So Castellanos thinks that Chinese are a criminal race, but they are not dangerous. So most of the time, Chinese people, they drink a lot of alcohol, they play cards, they gamble, but they are not violent. The problem for Castellanos are Afro-Cuban criminals. And Cubans and Africans are the true representatives of Cuban criminality. And this is what is probably Castellanos' most famous and most important publication, La brujería y ñañiguismo desde el punto de vista médico-legal, which was published in 1916. And the goal of the study is to draw a scientific distinction between the two main forms of black criminality in the island. So Castellanos wants to find the physical characteristics that allow to make a distinction between these two categories of criminal and normal criminals. So if we can move on, thank you. So here you can see a brujo, a curandero, and here you can see a ñañigo. Very briefly, Castellanos labeled these people as brujos, but in fact, it's a religion. It's not a sort of cult. Castellanos think they are a cult, but they are not. They are the sacerdotes del culto lucumí, which is imported from Cuba from Africa. It goes to Cuba. It was imported by black slaves. And ñañigos. Ñañigos for Castellanos are a sort of Cuban mafiosi. He thinks it's an organized criminal society, but in fact, the ñañigos still exist today. It's a sort of Freemasonry, black secret society, which still exists today. And Castellanos, of course, criminalized these two categories, and he tries to understand how to distinguish them. But the study of Castellanos is a total failure. Castellanos is not able to identify a single physical character that allowed to make the distinction between these two categories. So Castellanos has to resort not to criminal anthropology, but to ethnology. So he says, okay, in order to recognize a ñañigo, well, they have diablito tattooed on their arms. It's not a very scientific conclusion. And not a groundbreaking discovery, let's say. This is a ñañigo drawn by Castellanos himself. Okay, and then he says, okay, and in order to recognize a brujo, well, they always have a white beard, they have a pañuelo, and they have necklaces. So it's a complete failure. And here it's an example. So just this picture to show you that for Castellanos, the brujo is a primitive man, of course. And one of the proofs that he provides is the fact that the art of these African people is very primitive. That's what he thinks. And so despite all the contradictions and the failure of Castellanos' work, well, La brujería y ñañiguismo was awarded the gold medal in Cuba as the best work in forensic medicine of that year. And what I forgot to say is that in those years, there was a strong racial tension between Afro-Cuban and white elite. And so I think it's really clear that Castellanos was endorsed by the white elite and by the scientific community to kind of criminalize the black population. And now let's see another example of how close Castellanos was to political power in Cuba. So in 1929, Castellanos was the director of a National Institute of Identification, as I said. And so in the capacity of director, he has access to all the criminal records of all the people in Cuba. And he uses this documentation to write La delincuencia femenina en Cuba, which at the time was a rather strange topic. There were not many treatises on female criminality in the world in general. But Castellanos writes this book because, again, in this period in Cuba, women are at the center of the public debate. There is a strong feminist movement who wants women to have the right to vote. And Gerardo Machado promises that if he gets reelected, he will grant the vote to all the women in Cuba. And Castellanos, of course, is willing to help Gerardo Machado. This book is dedicated to Gerardo Machado in the first page. And so this book is divided into 2 volumes. The first volume is just a collection of statistics. The second volume shows a lot of pictures. And what Castellanos discovered is that the Cuban woman is the least criminal woman in the world. So all the book is a praise of the virtue of Cuban women that resist to crime. And Castellanos also implicitly say that it would be good to grant women the right to vote because they are better than men. And it's interesting because in this book, Castellanos says something completely different to Lombroso, because Lombroso also wrote the woman criminal and the female criminal, and Castellanos believed that women are more evil than men. But Castellanos thinks the opposite. And so he thinks that women from Cuba are extraordinary, etc. And there is another political aspect. There is this sense of pride that stems from the opera. Castellanos really believes that his work is unique and that his work also shows how advanced the scientific community in Cuba is. So we can really see how Castellanos' work is linked to the political power and also to a nationalistic dimension. And of course, Castellanos had to tackle the topic of a relationship between female criminality and race. And Castellanos established a pigmentation hierarchy of criminality. So the more black is a woman, the more criminal she is. So of course, again, a racial hierarchy with the white being the less criminals and the black being the less criminals. But again, this study is a completely mess, as the wizardry in brujeria, because Castellanos contradicts himself in the very same page, because his statistics show that actually it's the mestizas who commit most crime, and that white women as strangers commit more crime than all the other. How does Castellanos try to justify his finding and all this contradiction? He says, well, black women are more criminal than the others. But the black women that commit crime in Cuba are not Cubans, are from the Antilles. And they are, and at the time, it was a wave of migration. And so again, we can see how criminology could help the political power. So he's saying, be careful, because there is this new wave of immigration, and it's very dangerous for Cuba. The same thing that he said in his 1916 publication. Okay, now, last slide on Castellanos. The second part of the book, as I said, is all about pictures. There are more than 300 pictures of 300 women. And the book is all like that. We have a series of mugshots of women in front and in profile. And we also have a description of, well, biographical data, such as their age, are they married or not, level of education. But they also have a Lombrosian memory, because they report the physical characteristic of the women, the criminal physical features. And despite all the contradictions that characterize this work was awarded the Lombroso Prize in 1929. And Castellanos was the first Latin American scholar to be awarded the prize. So what is very interesting to me is to see the reaction of the Cuban scientific community. Here, I just chose one quote, but believe me, there are many articles that report the news, and it seems that for Cuba, this was perceived as a big thing. So the main narrative is that finally, we as Cubans are recognized by the rest of the world as a country where we do proper science. And I think that this is interesting also because it tells us a lot about the importance of Lombroso. The name of Lombroso was still perceived as very important. And so being awarded the Lombroso Prize was seen as an honor for Cuba. Okay, so let's now move on to our second hero or villain of presentation, Leonidio Ribeiro. And what I will try to do is to show you how many things these two persons have in common. And Leonidio Ribeiro, just to give you a full disclaimer, is a person that I hate with all my heart, really, but it's not important, it's not relevant. So again, he considered himself, he called himself a humble doctor, but he had a very huge ego. Ribeiro wrote 3 autobiographies, which is insane. And as Castellanos, yeah, it's insane, but unfortunately it's true. And I had to read the 3 of them, which is even worse. And as Castellanos, Ribeiro self-fashioned himself as a man of very humble origins that managed to get to the top thanks to all his effort. So there's also this kind of common narrative of a self-made man. I don't believe him at all. But the story that he tells, I think it's interesting also for the history of science more in general, how there are these narratives, this construction of scientists, how these scientists construct themselves. And so the story is that he lived in this poor family, very humble family. His father was a doctor and he wanted him to study medicine, but Ribeiro doesn't like it at all. He does his studies in medicine, but at some point he almost failed. But then at some point something happened, as in the case of Castellanos. He decided he has to study, to be good for his family, etc., etc. But as in the case of Castellanos, there is one life-changing moment. And the life-changing moment in his career is 1930, when, guess what? Ribeiro S. Castellanos becomes appointed as director of the National Institute of Identification. But the person who appointed Ribeiro is Batista Luzardo. Batista Luzardo was the head of the police in Rio de Janeiro. And he was one of the persons that provided weapons to Vargas in order to establish his regime. So again, it's very deeply entangled with authoritarian regime. And here it's a quote: by accepting Batista Luzardo's invitation, my life changed forever, and blah, blah, blah. Here we can see some pictures of the Institute of Identification, because what I forgot to tell you is that Castellanos oversaw the renovation of the Institute. And of course, this renovation of the Institute was paid by the Vargas regime. And the goal was, of course, to kind of improve the social control of the society. And so here you can see, for example, the atelier where the pictures of criminals were taken. This is the fingerprint archive. So the fingerprints will be taken and the files, the fijas, will be kept in the archive. This is an example. This is one of the criminal suspects that were mug-shotted, photographed in the Institute of Identification. And this is the day of inauguration on the Institute. And what I would like to stress here is how entangled, as I said, the Institute was with a political goal of the Vargas regime. In this picture, you can see Ribeiro, and these are all high officials of the government. There should be the Minister of Justice there. I don't know which one is it, but it's there. And here you can see Batista Luzardo, the head of the police, who is very vehemently giving a speech. Okay, so in this Institute of Identification, Ribeiro established a laboratory of criminal anthropology. And in this laboratory of criminal anthropology, Ribeiro conduct two main studies. A study on, again, Black and mixed race people and homosexuals. So again, we can see how criminology kind of serve the purpose of criminalizing minorities of the population. And in the Vargas regime, Black people and homosexuals were considered a threat to the social order. So of course, there is the need to control them. And so Castellanos coined the term criminal biotypology, which is criminal anthropology, but updated with the theories of endocrinology. And so the idea is that, of course, criminals exhibit higher percentage of physical anomalies, but these anomalies are due to hormonal imbalance. So there is something that doesn't work quite well in their hormonal system, and this explains criminality and homosexuality because the two categories are overlapping. For example, Febronio is very famous in Brazil because he was one of the first serial killers of Brazil modern history, and he was homosexual, and he was Black, and he was a criminal. So of course, for Ribeiro, this is the proof that is a perfect proof that indeed Lombroso was right. So first study, he conducts a study on 33 Black and mixed race criminals convicted of murder. And he finds out that most of them have a longilinear body type. So they have very long arms, disproportionate legs and arms. And so again, this show in the eyes of Ribeiro that Lombroso was right, that indeed criminals are different from the rest of the population. However, Ribeiro never articulates the relationship between these traits and criminality. He just says, okay, I find out that 72% of them have long arms and long legs. Not groundbreaking evidence neither. And as I said, Ribeiro links these criminality with hormonal disorders. Next slide, please. So let's now move on to the second study. Very similar. Again, it's the same principle. It's a study conducted on 195 professional homosexuals, although Ribeiro doesn't explain what he means with this expression. If professional homosexuals mean male prostitutes or clients of male houses of prostitution. We don't know nothing about it. And again, this shows how Lombroso's theories were updated in light of endocrinology. Because what Ribeiro thinks he has found out is that there is a predominance of longilinear body type as the black criminal. So again, there are similarities between these two categories. But there is also a gender dimension because, of course, these homosexuals display female characters. For example, they have gynecomastia, so they have kind of female chest. They have what he calls a triangular shape of the pubic hair. They have a very female chest. So the idea is that something is wrong with these people, something is wrong with their hormonal system, and this explains why they are homosexuals. But since everything is due to an hormonal disorder, Ribeiro is not in favor of punishment. He sees these people as people that need medical help, and they should not be put in prison, but they should be medically treated to solve their sickness. Next slide, please. And Ribeiro did not only study adults, but unfortunately, he also studied children. And he established in Rio de Janeiro a Laboratorio de Biología Infantil, a laboratory of child biology. And this is very interesting because it really shows how under the Vargas regime, the criminal system was medicalized in a sense, because this laboratory was established in the premises, in the same building of the minor judge. So minors who were accused of misdeeds, before being tried by the judge, they were studied by Ribeiro and his collaborators. And on the basis of the medical diagnosis, the judge would decide whether or not to send him to prison, what kind of treatment is the best for him. So a blatant example, I think, of medicalization of justice. Next slide, please. And now, very briefly, what was Ribeiro's thought on eugenics and racism in general? And I think it's very instructive because we have many people, and most of them, they are not scholars. There is this kind of tendency to categorize people, especially from an historical point of view, racist science, non-racist science, fascist science, non-fascist science. But when we look at the sources, things are more complicated than that. For example, Ribeiro was in favor of sterilization. He defined sick people, sick and underage individuals, as useless people. But, and this is something unique because most of the Lombrosian scholars, especially in Italy, all the Lombrosian scholars, all the disciples of Lombroso, they were against negative eugenics. So this again shows how complex it is to kind of put a label. And he was also a huge fan of Mussolini. Of course, he was a very close friend of Vargas, and he sees Mussolini as a great statesman. And but however, when we look at the sources, it's more complicated than that because Ribeiro is against, consider stupid, the Nazi Germans' pursuit of a white and pure race. In his opinion, it's a delusion to think that there are something as pure Germans, pure Aryans. Okay, now very briefly. So in 1933, Ribeiro was awarded the Lombroso Prize, again, for his research, for the fact that he created this laboratory, and for the fact that he conducted these two studies on criminals and homosexuals, black criminals and homosexuals. In this picture was taken in Turin, in my city, in 1935. This is the Royal Academy of Medicine. And here you can see Ribeiro, who has just accepted the Lombroso Prize. And here, well, you can't see, but this is Mario Carrara. And so upon accepting the prize, Ribeiro gave a speech, of course, to the public. And in this speech, it's very interesting because it's 1933. Lombroso, at this point, has been dead for 20 years. And he basically admits that all his work was inspired by Lombroso. And so he says, when I established the Laboratory of Criminal Anthropology, what I did was simply to copy the work done in Italy by Mario Carrara and Salvatore Ottolenghi. And I've always worked following the genius of Cesare Lombroso. As in Cuba, this is another similarity. As in Cuba, there is the fact that a Brazilian scholar has been awarded the prize is seen as a big thing for Brazilian science. Again, we have two authoritarian states that are looking for legitimization from the outside, and the Lombroso Prize is seen as that kind of legitimization. And so these are some of the, this is one of the most important newspaper of Rio de Janeiro at the time, exceptional tribute to Brazilian science. This is just to give you an idea of how important the prize was seen by Brazilian scientific community. Now I'm jumping to the conclusion. These are the last slides. I just would like to briefly touch upon Ribeiro's conception of biological determinism, because again, things are more complicated than it seems at first sight. So he's convinced that there is a biological predisposition to crime, but this is just a biological predisposition. So in order for this predisposition to become real crime, there are several factors. In order to trigger this predisposition, there are other factors to take into account, such as environment, family, the medical profile, etc., etc. And in 1938, he says the born criminal of Lombroso does not exist. So I think this shows how the Lombrosian theory evolved throughout the time. So there was still this idea of a biological predisposition, but at the same time, the idea of a born criminal in the 38 was not considered acceptable anymore. Lombroso remained an inspiration for many people, but his ideas were considered outdated. But this does not mean that Ribeiro did not continue to admire enormously Lombroso. In 1966, so almost 60 years after the death of Lombroso, Ribeiro is still saying that Lombroso is one of the most brilliant figures in the history of science. So from my point of view, being interested in the legacy of Cesare Lombroso, I believe that the case of Ribeiro is really illustrative of how important Lombroso continued to be in the decades following his death. Penultimate slide. In the 50s, these two people met in Cuba. And I wanted to conclude by showing you these two pictures. This is Ribeiro giving a presentation in Cuba. He was invited by Castellanos. And actually, on this occasion, it's the 53, I think, Castellanos says, when he introduced his guest, he says, Ribeiro, like myself, is a Lombrosian criminal anthropologist in the 50s. That's, for me, it's amazing. And the physical proximity of these two people, I think it's a good metaphor of all the things that these two criminologists had in common, all the things that I tried to show you. So first of all, this idea that they were born in a humble family and they managed to get to the top. The fact that they were both appointed around the same years as directors of their relative national institutes of identification. They both studied and contributed to the criminalization of racial and sexual minorities. They were both awarded the Lombroso Prize, and they still call themselves Lombrosian in the 50s. And so with this slide, I just wanted to conclude. As I said, these two cases show the extraordinary longevity of Lombroso theories and also show how many things Castellanos and Ribeiro have in common. And thank you very much for your attention.
Presentación muy interesante, sin duda. Bueno, y ahora doy la palabra a Aide García, que es candidata a doctora por el posgrado en Filosofía de la Ciencia, investigadora del Centro de Investigaciones Interdisciplinarias en Ciencias y Humanidades de ambas instituciones de la UNAM. Bueno, además ella cuenta con distintas publicaciones sobre la historia de los estudios antropológicos y antropométricos, por lo que este tema del legado del Lombroso creo es de su interés y tendrá participaciones muy interesantes. No le doy la palabra.
Gracias. En primer lugar, a Laura Cházaro, que me invitó a participar de esta conferencia y hacer algunos comentarios, y por supuesto a mis colegas, a Franco Orlandi y a Gerardo García, a quien estimo mucho. Bueno, digamos, no soy experta propiamente en Cesare Lombroso y tampoco, digamos, en el siglo XX, que complejiza, como bien lo has planteado, algunas de las cuestiones, pero bueno, haré algún tipo de comentarios y sobre todo en dos, digamos, como grandes tipos. Por una parte, la cuestión del contexto político, que me parece muy relevante, y rumbo al final, mi comentario no será muy largo, haré algunas puntuaciones a partir de los textos que me fueron proporcionados, los cuales también agradezco. Y digamos, la segunda parte más bien tendría que ver con una discusión mucho más epistemológica sobre cómo analizar cómo estos personajes van a observar, o sea, qué significa la observación para estos personajes en esta serie, digamos, de cuestiones que tú muy bien nos has planteado sobre las contradicciones que conlleva, ¿no? Entonces, por una parte, quizá empezaría por la propia idea de legado transatlántico y otra vez trataría de señalar cómo muchas veces desde la propia proposición puede haber una cierta perspectiva difusionista de ese legado. Es decir, como si efectivamente, y que hasta cierto punto es así, pero cómo revertimos algo que me ha interesado a lo largo del estudio, digamos, de las clasificaciones craneológicas y de restos humanos, que en realidad no me interesan en sí mismas, sino justamente para plantear las bases de una forma de pensar en la antropología, de una cuestión epistemológica que necesariamente está relacionada con esas cuestiones fisiológicas, anatómico-patológicas, como se decía en el siglo XIX. Entonces, sí me parece relevante pensar que ¿por qué hablar de legado y por qué tu sorpresa respecto a que 50 años después de la muerte del Lombroso siga habiendo estas reverberaciones, digamos? Y ahí quizá iría mi primera pregunta en el sentido de, si tú piensas que las producciones académicas de estos personajes tuvieron alguna lectura en la propia, digamos, publicaron en Madrid, publicaron también en diversas lenguas, pero si esas producciones de Israel Castellanos y Leonidio Ribeiro tuvieron una lectura, no solo por quienes otorgaban el premio Lombroso, sino, digamos, por en la cuestión criminalística y de la antropología biológica de los años 30 y 40, que estaba, digamos, también en una disputa digamos, epistemológica y política muy importante en la propia Europa, en el sentido de los regímenes totalitarios que existían, pero también en las disputas que se manifiestan muy bien en los años 50 sobre la propia categoría de raza y el desmontar la idea de los procesos de racialización para ese momento. Pero entonces, pues, ¿cómo? Si tuvo algunas lecturas, aunque hayan sido negativas, digamos, justamente para criticarlas, pero ¿por qué a veces las producciones, digamos, que se generan en América Latina, en este caso muy específicamente en Cuba y Brasil, quizá no tienen la misma reverberación como lo pudo hacer Cesare Lombroso en América Latina, como bien, que es lo que bien señalas, ¿no? Es decir, si hay un tornaviaje, como algunos le llaman, ¿no? Si hay un tornaviaje de estas perspectivas, así sea con un sentido crítico en ese contexto europeo de los años 30 y 40, incluso de los 50, ¿no? Y luego, por otra parte, entender algunas cosas que me llevan también a quizá preguntarte algunas cuestiones. Por una parte, obviamente saber que hay un suelo o base, un espacio conceptual previo sobre el que llega la idea, las ideas, digamos, biológicas ligadas a la criminalidad de Cesare Lombroso, y ese espacio conceptual epistemológico tiene que ver con, digamos, cuestiones anteriores en el sentido justamente de las clasificaciones raciales de las poblaciones originarias y de lo que para nosotros es muy importante y son las categorías de mestizaje. Y ahí haría una primera pregunta en relación a lo que tú conoces muy bien de los archivos tanto de Israel Castellanos como de Ribeiro, en el sentido de si has o te ha interesado analizar esas clasificaciones, digamos, previas sobre las que ellos montaban sus ideas y si hay diferencias en el sentido de nombrar incluso a las propias personas racializadas, en el sentido de si se seguía manteniendo la idea de una cierta pureza en el sentido de una raza africana por alguien justamente inmigrado o traído o venido en esos momentos, porque en eso también hay una serie de cuestiones que tenemos que analizar políticas, y es la serie de migraciones que se dan en esos países, digamos, tanto al interior, sobre todo en Brasil, que es todo un continente, digamos, en sí mismo, pero en Cuba, justamente como tú bien lo señalas, y a la luz, digamos, de cuestiones políticas que se están ya generando en esos momentos, en los años 30 y 40, y como tú bien lo señalas, el régimen político de Vargas, perdón, de Batista, primero, y de Machado primero, me confundí con Brasil, después voy a Brasil, pero más bien primero en Cuba de Machado y después de Fulgencio Batista, que es justamente lo que derroca la Revolución Cubana. Pero entonces, esta serie de inmigraciones que se están dando al interior de la propia Cuba y cómo eso puede también generar, y lo hace para el propio Israel Vargas. Y a lo mejor ahí hago también otro comentario de cómo esa posición política que tenían tanto Castellanos como Ribeiro, que efectivamente tú bien señalaste la coincidencia, es decir, de este posicionamiento, cosa que no pasa para Mario Carrara, efectivamente, yerno de Lombroso y, digamos, discípulo, y sin embargo antifascista, aunque me gusta mucho que en uno de tus textos señalas también cómo Gramsci hace esta crítica a la pseudociencia lombrosiana en el sentido de que el propio Carrara tenía, digamos, estos estudios en un instituto donde estaban también infantes y se suicida uno de ellos, y es cuando Gramsci señala tenemos que parar con esta línea de pseudociencia lombrosiana, ¿no? Y me parece muy relevante cómo pueden compartir una visión antifascista y sin embargo tienen, digamos, una perspectiva distinta del mismo planteamiento lombrosiano sobre la criminalidad y sobre si efectivamente el criminal es nato o no. Pero iba a esto porque me parece también que a veces sería interesante hacer un análisis comparado en relación a Israel Castellanos y el propio Fernando Ortiz Fernández, que comparten en un primer momento, digamos, por supuesto, la perspectiva lombrosiana y los intereses de estudio, porque Fernando Ortiz pues publica también en 1906 la inmigración desde el punto de vista criminológico. Por eso hablaba yo de estas preocupaciones, de qué es lo que está ocurriendo en Cuba a la luz de la relativamente reciente independencia de 1898 y esta serie de cuestiones que todavía están muy cercanas a eso y que lo ven venir en el sentido de la disputa entre, digamos, imperial en ese momento para España en decadencia y con Estados Unidos, sabiendo que hay ahí un interés económico muy fuerte, ¿no? Entonces, y bueno, el propio Fernando Ortiz también habla de los negros brujos, apuntes para un estudio de etnología criminal, es decir, están muy cercanos y se estudian muchas veces como relacionados, y sin embargo, justo para los años 30, que es en el 29 cuando recibe el premio César el Lombroso Castellanos, ya hay una distancia muy grande que ha establecido el propio Fernando Ortiz, y que justamente para cuando arriba la Revolución Cubana, pues se decantarán en las antípodas uno y otro, ¿no? Serán, digamos, antagonistas en eso, y bueno, es muy conocida la idea de transculturación, digamos, que pone en cuestión las ideas racistas y racialistas, y es justamente de 1940, el libro del contrapunteo cubano del tabaco y el azúcar, ¿no? De Fernando Ortiz. Por supuesto, su análisis de Martí y las razas, que también va a hacer un desmontaje de esa idea, y el más conocido del 46, el engaño de las razas, o sea, donde ya efectivamente Ortiz, digamos, reniega de esa primera parte suya y primera perspectiva y va a tener este análisis de que la raza es una ficción, es un invento, es un engaño generado justamente en estas disputas por el poder, y que va a ser muy importante entonces como para plantear toda una otra vertiente que tendrá, digamos, su vertiente política en la revolución del Che y de Fidel, en fin, en Cuba, ¿no? Entonces, eso por una parte. Y por otra, también lo que quizá me interesaría respecto al Brasil plantear una serie de discusiones que lo hace ya Lilia Moritz-Schwartz, ¿no? Que ha estudiado, digamos, es una estudiosa tanto de la historia de Brasil como este libro del espectáculo de las razas, porque ella va a plantear que hay, y que eso me interesaría saber, porque finalmente Ribeiro se ubica o sea, digamos, se ubica muy cercanamente a las ideas que tenía otro previo a lo que él va a decir, que es justamente Raimundo Nina Rodríguez, que también, digamos, es lombrosiano, pero que se ubica en algo, o sea, digamos, en un lugar distinto porque es Bahía, donde va a estar sobre todo haciendo los estudios Nina Rodríguez, y sin embargo publican, bueno, digamos, Nina Rodríguez fallece cuando apenas está, digamos, surgiendo, bueno, ni está todavía como figura porque todavía no se va a Francia, Leonido Ribeiro, pero donde Ribeiro, yo pienso que sí que retomará una perspectiva de Nina Rodríguez y entonces quizá hacer esa genealogía, no solo digamos, del legado lombrosiano per se, sino de las múltiples vertientes que hay en el propio Brasil, además ligados efectivamente a la eugenesia, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, ¿cómo hay ahí esta discusión? Y finalmente, digamos, no olvidar que estas cuestiones, bueno, entonces, ¿y por qué lo decía? Y con esto voy a ir tratando de cerrar, pero decía que justo en el libro, Lilia Moritz-Schwartz va a hablar de una disputa respecto a la medicina legal y criminalística entre las dos escuelas, entre la de Bahía y la de Sao Paulo, que es donde va a estar ubicado finalmente Ribeiro, ¿no? Entonces, como igual hay digamos, una base común lombrosiana y, sin embargo, quizá algunos matices que diferencian estas cuestiones. Entonces, bueno, eso por ahí y bueno, mencionar por supuesto los estudios que la propia Laura ha hecho en México de Daniel Vergara López y Martínez Vaca y los estudios que hicieron en la penitenciaría, en Puebla, en fin, es decir, previo a estos autores hay toda una base conceptual, primero de una perspectiva de antropología, digamos, racial, que está muy difundida en México, al menos con la llegada efectivamente de la intervención francesa, y después con justamente las adaptaciones y configuraciones que se van dando, pero que encajan también con esta antropología criminal que se va a estar desarrollando, y es como sobre todo ese también legado propio latinoamericano donde van a estar estas figuras insertándose y a lo mejor ver esas diferencias. Y ahí entonces, pues esto, digamos, enfatizar que si las clasificaciones estas que han ido adquiriendo características y matices específicos en cada país, si por ejemplo Castellanos y Ribeiro estarán hablando de mestizos en el mismo sentido para Cuba y para Brasil o no, ¿no? O sea, ¿qué significa? Y por ahí te haría una observación un tanto crítica, pero con mucho respeto en el sentido de en tu propio texto tú dices, bueno, y Castellanos es un mestizo. Yo misma me preguntaba, bueno, pero ¿quién no lo es, digamos? O en ese sentido, ¿a qué se estará refiriendo? Porque es así, más allá de que los propios autores utilicen las categorías que efectivamente tienen su contexto y que tú mismo dices, si tiene rasgos orientales, ¿no? Por esta vertiente que tenía también del abuelo, en fin, o del padre, ahora no recuerdo, pero donde me parece interesante ver digamos, a mí no me lo parece, ¿no? Pero, y ahí entonces iría a la cuestión de la observación, del sentido de la observación y del ver, y de cómo tú mismo, digamos, señalas que las conclusiones a las que llegaban tenían un sentido de generalidad, pero se basaban muchas veces en pocos casos, o en casos que eran tomados como ejemplos significativos en personas, incluso un poco como el propio Villela, este criminal calabrese que estudió Lombroso para hablar digamos, de la configuración, con un caso planteó, digamos, el delincuente nato, ¿no? Entonces, y cómo en ocasiones, muchas veces las observaciones eran contradictorias. Queda muy bien puesto de manifiesto cuando abordas el caso del libro sobre las mujeres en Cuba, ¿no? Porque entonces, claro, en el sentido político va a decir, son menos criminales, ¿no? Que justamente las que van a migrar de Haití o República Dominicana o de la propia África, porque han tenido ya este contacto con la cultura cubana, es decir, y sin embargo, podríamos, haciendo alusión al sentido de la observación lombrosiano, decir no hay ninguna diferencia, ¿no? O sea, o dónde radica entonces la forma de mirar de la que están señalando. No sé si eso te interesa y quisiera entonces que plantearas algunas reflexiones sobre la noción de ver y observar en estos personajes y también de medir y registrar, porque es lo que guía, digamos, su caracterización de quiénes son las personas y criminales y cómo esa criminalización está directamente ligada a lo afro, ¿no? A lo afro y también a lo indígena, aunque ahí te preguntaría justamente si hay algunas diferencias, porque finalmente lo que nos presenta Castellanos, o sea, que tú recuperas en tus textos, que son los que conozco hasta ahora, pues se refiere sobre todo a la raíz africana, ¿no? Pero sí habría también estas, y bueno, porque finalmente muchas veces se piensa que en Cuba se perdieron hasta cierto punto, se extinguieron y acabaron con los grupos indígenas y sin embargo, bueno, hay todavía ahí incluso disputas en ese sentido y también de los sincretismos que se daban. Y bueno, ¿por qué me interesa? Pues porque finalmente eso, o sea, todas esas correlaciones o sea, relaciones entre fisonomía, caracteres morales y sexuales, porque también, como bien lo señalas, el propio Ribeiro también va a estar estudiando cuestiones de sexualidad y sobre todo relacionado a esto con la homosexualidad, justo en un momento en donde es totalmente ligada a una patología médica. Y fíjate, ahí también me gustaría preguntarte, porque enfatizas que Ribeiro se fue también por un ámbito ya no solo fisonómico, sino también endocrinólogo o endocrinológico, pero Carrara también lo hizo rumbo a la última parte de su vida, ¿no? Y justo lo vi por el texto en el que estudias a Carrara. Entonces me gustaría ahí ver esas relaciones y me parece que estas visiones que muchas veces contienen perspectivas contradictorias, en fin, pero siguen siendo un precedente que continúa vigente en lo que significa el rostro y en lo que llamamos la aportación de cara, en el sentido de que puede ser señalado tanto por la policía en nuestros países, pero también al ir, digamos, a Europa, para las grandes migraciones, que además cada vez las vemos mucho más generalizadas, ¿no? En todos nuestros países. O sea, pienso en México y en la serie de poblaciones que en este momento lo están atravesando, ya no solo de América Latina, de Haití, de Venezuela, de Cuba, en fin, de todos los, de Colombia, de todos estos países, sino también, pues, de la propia África y de también migraciones asiáticas, ¿no? Pero lo mismo ocurre en Europa para estos momentos y cómo eso, digamos, esa asociación entre estos rasgos sigue teniendo un gran peso para los diversos encierros, ¿no? Para los lugares de encerramiento, no solo de cuestiones mentales, sino justamente los grandes campos de concentración actuales, que son los campos para migrantes en Europa y por supuesto los que están en Estados Unidos y de alguna manera también las experiencias que hemos tenido, por ejemplo, cuando hubo el incendio aquí en México muy recientemente, ¿no? Entonces, en un centro de migración, sí. Entonces, bueno, pues por ahí habría, y quizá algunos puntos, pero más bien anecdóticos, en el sentido de si has estudiado justamente digamos, este asesinato, ¿no? De la mujer de Bonacea y esta relación que también daría para mucho en el sentido de la cuestión del feminicidio, obviamente todavía no catalogado como tal ni nada, pero sí hablar de estos crímenes pasionales que fue como durante mucho tiempo se habló de este tipo de relaciones y donde nuevamente hay una criminalización de la mujer por algunas conductas y que, digamos, podríamos verlo desde un punto de vista bastante crítico, pero bueno, iría por ahí y, por supuesto, la relación entre estudiar a los sujetos de la brujería, tal como lo hizo Castellanos en su momento sobre el ñañigüismo y la brujería, en fin, y las diferencias o no que tenían, y la antropología que se ha desarrollado después en torno a esos temas, ¿no? Es decir, cómo finalmente ese interés después tuvo otras lecturas muy distintas que dejaron de criminalizar esas cuestiones y de verlas bajo otra perspectiva, y a lo mejor a veces estudiar esa transformación epistemológica pues puede ser muy importante, porque cómo se empieza con un enfoque y se va transformando. Ahí sí pareciera que la antropología hasta cierto punto fue dejándose impactar por esa misma relación o interacción con esas prácticas e intentó una comprensión un tanto distinta. Entonces, bueno, iría por ahí, y cómo es también tan relevante lo que actualmente pasa tanto en Cuba como en Brasil respecto a sus antropologías, que han recuperado mucho de la producción negra e indígena. Entonces, bueno, yo lo dejaría por ahí, pero te agradezco mucho la lectura de tus textos, la exposición tan clara también, y bueno, tus textos además me parecen muy ricos en el sentido, digamos, de fuentes y de justamente de cómo haces interactuar estas fuentes, el archivo y las propias producciones de los autores desde una perspectiva crítica, pero quizá yo diría que había que enfatizar más todavía esa perspectiva crítica, tal cual como lo has planteado ahora, ¿no? Casi, pues sí, de decir manifestar cierto, digamos, disgusto con el propio Ribeiro, que efectivamente, y bueno, y con el propio Castellanos, porque sí que tenían esta perspectiva que no podemos negar, que racializa y criminaliza, o sea, asocia estas dos cuestiones muy fuertemente en sus estudios con cierto tipo de poblaciones, ¿no? Y entonces justifica una forma de trato, tal como lo señalas, para la perspectiva, que aunque ahí están las contradicciones, ¿no? Ribeiro dice, no creo en el criminal nato, y sin embargo, pero ejerzamos la eugenesia, ¿no? Sí hay que evitar que siga habiendo cierto tipo de manifestaciones. Entonces uno dice, bueno, una cosa puede ser lo que diga declaradamente, explícitamente, y otra lo que realmente con la propia propuesta que está enfatizando, pues está haciendo. Bueno, pues yo por ahí le dejaría, pero yo creo que andan para mucho los textos y esa es una gran riqueza.
Gracias, muchísimas gracias. No, o sea, realmente, grazie mille. Thank you very much for a very rich commentary and for reading my text and reading it how you did it, so really carefully. So I will start from the end. So you suggested that I emphasize to kind of adopt a more critical perspective on what I study. I think you're right. That's a good suggestion indeed. As for very interesting what you mentioned, la transformación epistemológica de la brujería, and this brings me also to your other question. So the relationship between Castellanos and Ortiz, because it's true that in Cuba there is not only Castellanos, there is also Fernando Ortiz, and Fernando Ortiz still today is seen as one of the fathers of the rediscovery of the Black heritage in Cuba. And this epistemological transformation is mainly due, I think, to Ortiz is one of those who kind of changed the way of reading. And so I will start from these. So the case of Ortiz, which you know more than I do, that's for sure, is very interesting because he starts as a very orthodox Lombrosian. He writes Los Negros Brujos, and Lombroso is very happy about his work. And he sends him a letter saying, he writes the introduction, and he says, your book is great, but next time, please perform measurement on the body of the brujos. And Castellanos, who of course has read Los Negros Brujos, seeks to perfectionate the work of Ortiz. So his idea is that, okay, Ortiz gave us the basic understanding. Now I will add something more, which is measuring the body. And so in this moment, Ortiz and Castellanos are almost on the same track. But at some point, there is a brutal change. And Ortiz becomes the person who says, no, African heritage is very important for our culture. But so it kind of changed his mind. Castellanos does not. And this is something that it's true. I should really reflect more on this. I didn't do it also because I didn't want to have a text that was too big. But I think is a very important point, that one that we just mentioned, the difference between Castellanos and Ortiz. Because in the 30s, for example, Ortiz launched this journal, which is Archivo Folclórico. I think the title is something like that, de Cuba. And Castellanos is invited to publish an article, and he studies the musical instruments of Africans. And the idea of Ortiz is, of course, we show how important the musical heritage, African musical heritage, is for Cuban culture. And Castellanos writes an article saying how primitive the sound of Africans are. So he really does not change his mind. He collaborates with Ortiz, and he does not change his mind. And what is also a bit shocking is that in the 40s, when Ortiz was the dominating paradigm, so there was this idea, of course, that black Afro-Cuban are very important for the culture and support. This rediscovery, as you said, Castellanos republished all his works on the criminality of Afro-Cuban. So it's a kind of, I think, statement saying, no, it's not a rediscovery. Everyone needs to know that these people are dangerous. So this is very important to kind of compare these two people. You are not the first person who recommends me to do so. So now it's really the time to incorporate this into my chapter. Very interesting what you said about, from an epistemological point of view, el sentido de la observación y del ver. It's true that I have not really reflected on this, and perhaps I should, because it's sure that the way these scientists observe is really biased. It's not, so the impression that I have is really that these people, they have an idea, they have a theory, and it doesn't matter what kind of evidence they find, they will always prove their point. And one of a blatant example of this biased way of observing and seeing, I think, is Castellanos, because at some point, when Castellanos studied the skulls of a black criminal, and as you said, it's crazy how all these theories, universal theories, like Africans are criminals, are based on one skull, two skulls. So there's this, as you said, it's striking, it's absurd, the difference between the universal value of a theory and the material in which it's actually grounded on. And so just to give an example of this sentido de la observación, at some point, one of the skull has a very big cranial capacity. So this black person has a very big cranial capacity. And instead of arguing, perhaps this is a sign that this person was very intelligent, he says, okay, this shows that the bone is very thick. So it's a kind of way of putting aside all the evidence that could contradict the theory and just move on. So I think I could reflect more on this, and perhaps later on, if you could perhaps suggest me a couple of texts that I could read on this notion, it would be really great. Ribeiro, Carrara, endocrinology, very briefly. So endocrinology becomes very important for criminal anthropology, not only in Brazil, but also in Italy. And what is interesting, because we talked about a transatlantic legacy, perhaps in my presentation, I emphasized too much the fact that it's a knowledge that travels from Europe to Latin America, but also it's also true the other way around. For example, Ribeiro's studies on endocrinology were used by Carrara to prove that Lombroso was right, and also to demonstrate that homosexuals should not be punished by the fascist criminal code. So he says, okay, there is a Brazilian guy who has just proved that homosexuals are sick people, and we should really use his findings to change the criminal code. And the case of Pebronio, on the other hand, so this homosexual serial killer, is very much used by Carrara. He says, well, this is a proof that Lombroso was right, because these people, so sexual minorities and criminalities are kind of overlapped. So Bonancea's wife, it's very interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have many sources. There's just a letter which is available online, where Bonancea sends the physical description for Lombroso to analyze. And one of the things, I think one of the most interesting points you made is the fact that there's not just a Lombrosian criminal anthropology. Lombrosian criminal anthropology arrives but the soil has already been fertilized by other theories, right? By other anthropologists. And this is something that I have to admit I have not looked into yet, but perhaps I should, because perhaps what I consider the legacy of Lombroso is actually not only the legacy of Lombroso, it's a legacy that goes way back into the past. So again, perhaps later on we could exchange, you could send me a couple of reading recommendations. The fact, talking about Brazil and Raimundo Nina Rodriguez, of course, Rodriguez is very important for the history of criminal anthropology in Brazil. I don't really know, because Nina Rodriguez is not very much quoted by Ribeiro in his work, but what is clear is that Ribeiro establishes this sort of scientific genealogy. He says, okay, first comes Nina Rodriguez, then come Afrânio Peixoto, and then it's me. So he kind of draws a scientific legacy saying, I am the hire of Lombroso in Brazil. Because he said, okay, Rodriguez was the master of my master, and so now I am the master. So there is this implicit positioning himself as a, so that's the legacy that I've seen, but perhaps there's something more and I should look into that a bit more. I don't know if you, and yeah, that's it. I would say, I think what I really should look into more is the pre-existing anthropological tradition, but also this epistemological notion of observing and how these people observe, and could be a good reading tool. So thank you so much, Aiden. Really, thank you so much.
Sí, gracias.
Bueno,
No sé si alguien primero podemos dar la palabra
Aquí al público. Ya lo pregunté.
sí, ya te aprendí.
Sí, sí, por favor, si tienen preguntas, porque el público de afuera también puede. Pues,
Claro, sí.
sí, sí.
Ok, gracias Franco por la ponencia, por la conferencia. Y yo tengo una pregunta que tiene que ver un poco con lo que te estaba preguntando, Aide, sobre qué pasa con las trayectorias locales de toda la medicina, de toda la antropología local, que pareciera que viene desde fuera en la conferencia, ¿no? Y pues justamente yo creo que hay unas ideas y unas trayectorias intelectuales, epistemológicas, locales, que van a poner el terreno fértil para que llegue el Lombroso o las ideas del Lombroso y sean utilizadas por estos médicos, antropólogos. Y justamente una de las preguntas que me surge es, ¿qué tanto está relacionado estos antropólogos médicos y cuál es el papel de estos antropólogos criminales, criminológicos, dentro de las comunidades médicas locales? Porque pareciera que están como aislados y que ellos son los únicos especialistas en este tipo de antropometría, cuando hay, pues, obviamente, antropometría desde prácticas locales desde antes, ¿no? Y la otra pregunta tiene que ver con la endocrinología y bueno, y justamente como en el régimen de Vargas en Brasil hay un impulso a todos los estudios endocrinológicos y fisioantropológicos desde los 20s, 30s, ¿no? Y la pregunta también es hacia el Cuba, ¿qué tanto están en relación lo que está haciendo el personaje cubano con los estudios antropológicos y de fisiología para evidenciar la separación racial que están llevándose a cabo en la Carnegie, por ejemplo, que llevan a cabo los estudios de Stegerda en Jamaica y que producen este libro de Race Crossing en Jamaica, ¿no? Y que trataban de buscar la diferenciación racial para evitar la migración de los mezclados, ¿no? Y también una pregunta ya más general es, hablas en varios momentos de una perspectiva sesgada y como pseudociencias, y yo no sé, justamente yo no sé si en ese momento alguien se está percatando de que esto es una perspectiva sesgada. O sea, justamente cómo se está construyendo esta perspectiva desde la ciencia, desde una perspectiva normalizada. Y me parece que ahí está una perspectiva, o sea, yo entiendo que desde ahorita podemos pensar esto, ¿no? Que es una perspectiva sesgada, pero en ese momento, ¿cómo se va construyendo esta normalidad de la normal, ¿no? Esta normalidad del criminal, racializada y eugenésica, como lo quieras. Gracias.
Puedo contestar ahora. Muchísimas gracias por las preguntas. Entonces, so local trajectory of anthropology. Again, I have to admit it's something that I've not been paying very much attention to. Perhaps my mistake is that sometimes most of the sources that I read are sources produced by Lombrosian. So when they say, I am the only one who has carried out this study, I tend to take this not for granted, but I don't really much investigate. But this is something I should really pay attention to, and I have to admit my ignorance on this point. In the case of Cuba, I think Fernando Ortiz was very important for Castellanos, but it's true that Castellanos tends to self-fashion himself as the first who is carrying out this kind of anthropology in Cuba. But we don't have to believe in it. But so this is something, unfortunately, I can't really respond to that. But what you also said, so the relationship with the medical community, right? Again, I don't have many sources, but the fact that Castellanos work on la brujería was awarded the golden medal for the best work. And I forgot to tell you something. In the 20s, the 30s, Castellanos published other studies that were all awarded the golden medal by the Academia Médica de Habana. So I think that overall in his career, he won 4 golden medals for the best work in forensic medicine. So this makes me think that he was very close to the medical community. He was a doctor, because all these criminal anthropologists are 99% are forensic doctors, medical guys. And so I think that his work was very well accepted by the medical community. But unfortunately, I can't say a lot more about this. I should really look into the soil, as you said. So there are these ideas, but something that predates them allowed to this paradigm to kind of rise up. Very important question, the endocrinology. What's the role in endocrinology? What happens in the Vargas regime in Brazil happens in Italy. So endocrinology has been called by an historian the fascist science. And I think that one of the reasons is the idea that hormonal imbalance can be corrected by doctors with the means also of surgery. And so since all these regimes aim to create a new nation, there is this idea, I think, that endocrinology provides the tools to change the people, to create a new generation, a new society. And of course, this is very much linked to eugenics. For example, in Italy, the idea that people can be corrected by means of changing their hormones translates into the rejection of negative eugenics. So why shouldn't we kill people if we can correct them? And so I think it's interesting to see how endocrinology becomes a regime science in 2 different countries, and how important also for Carrara, for example. Carrara was anti-fascist, but for him, despite the fact that endocrinology was very much a fascist science, he really thought it's great for criminal anthropology. Also because Lombrosian was never able to explain what's the relationship between the body and the mind. So he said, okay, criminals are ugly and they are violent, but how is it possible? And endocrinology seems to offer the answer. A glandular disorder provokes certain physical features, and that's true today. And at the same time, it can affect the mind. And so for criminal anthropologists, this was the proof at Lombrosian. As for the construction, so how come that there's this construction of the criminal? I think that, again, There are many ideas predating Lombroso. Again, Lombroso is one of those people who says, I am the first. But there are some studies that show that actually Lombroso took a lot from our tradition, from phrenology, So I think that Lombroso was the first, and that's part of my answer. So I think that Lombroso was the first to kind of make a systematic construction of the criminal act. He was the first to really put it on paper in a very not coherent way, because it's not very coherent at all. But he's the first to kind of take all these elements and to build. And so if we have to draw up a genealogy of the construction of anormality, I think that Lombroso is really the first, the one should. I don't know if I really answered your question. I hope so. Thank you. Thanks so much.
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? Diego.
Diego, y hay otras preguntas en YouTube y en Zoom.
No, Diego.
Hola. A ver si logro formular bien la pregunta, porque tiene que ver justo también con la endocrinología. Y quería preguntarte qué tan, un poco que nos pudieras, tú que has estudiado al respecto, como más claridad en qué es continuidad y qué es ruptura, en el hecho de que se está buscando al criminal en una búsqueda del cuerpo, pero ya no en el cuerpo, pues en la medida del cuerpo literal, sino más bien ahora profundamente en la hormona, ¿no? Entonces a mí pues me parecería, no tampoco que sepa mucho al respecto, que esto responde a que hay como una idea lombrosiana de buscar, que como ya dices tú, lo toma desde la fenomenología está, de buscar en el cuerpo la cognición y la conducta, pero ahora, ¿no? En un momento, ya en los 50, ¿no? En estos casos, donde ya se está buscando en un corte que ya no es superficial, sino parecería que más bien va a la profundidad y ya no es en el cuerpo que está tangible, ¿no? Se está dejando el ojo clínico, sino que el cuerpo que muestran instrumentos como la medición de las hormonas. Entonces, un poco ver qué es continuidad y qué es ruptura en esta búsqueda del cuerpo y en estos tipos de cortes, ¿no?
Muchas gracias. It's very interesting because the way this change was read changed depending on the actors involved. So for Lombrosian criminal anthropologists, it was not perceived as a discontinuity. For them, it was simply a way of perfectioning the ideas of Lombroso. So the tool was more precise now to assess the criminality of a person. And it's true. So it goes from a very crude understanding of a human body to a more subtle, so looking at inside. But the way people like Ribeiro or Carrara assess the endocrinological imbalance is still very crude, because in the practice it doesn't change much. So to assess that someone has or has not hormonal imbalance, what do they say? They look at how long their arms are, how many hairs do they have, how ugly they are. So I would say that if we look at the Lombrosians, what they do, it doesn't really change. From a practical point of view, the way they study the body of the people doesn't change. What changed is the scientific legitimization, because you can really see that these Lombrosians in the 20s, in the 30s, are very much galvanized by endocrinology. Because I think that these people really suffered from a complex of inferiority. Because, of course, I talked about Lombroso, how influential he was, but we should not forget that Lombroso was harshly criticized. All these schools were harshly criticized when Lombroso was alive and when Lombroso died. And so for the criminal anthropologist, endocrinology is the ultimate tool to prove Lombroso was right. So I would say it was not seen as a disruption, and there is a lot of continuity. Because, for example, Nicola Pende is the person who coined the term endocrinology. He's considered to be the founding father of endocrinology. He was an Italian. Very close to Mussolini. He signed the Manifesto della Razza in 1938. So he's considered the worst and most evil, one of the most evil scientists of fascist Italy. And he was an admirer of Lombroso. And the way he studied, he publishes a study on the relationship between criminality and endocrinology. It basically says Lombroso had a very good idea, and he was actually right, but he was not looking into the right place. So if we look at criminal anthropologists, there is not a discontinuity, but if we look at the endocrinologists, there is a discontinuity because they are better at criminal anthropology. That's my answer to your question. Thank you, David.
Entonces,
Puedo, empezamos a unas preguntas en YouTube o en
Ujú.
Zoom. No sé si quién pueda
Sí,
leerlas.
aquí las voy a leer yo.
Gracias.
Bueno, primero vamos con las de Zoom. Rafael Peralta pregunta, dice, sobre la relación entre la Revolución Cubana y la teoría de Castellanos, se asocia criminalidad y raza. ¿Hubo desacreditación? ¿Las desecharon? ¿Hubo continuidad? Esa es la primera pregunta. Y la segunda, en el caso de Ribeiro y de los estudios de la criminalidad, ¿llegó a tratar el caso de los cargaceiros? En caso de que sí, ¿cómo lidió con el hecho de que varios de los líderes de estos eran blancos como Corisco? Esas son las preguntas de Rafael Peralta.
Sí, muchas gracias, Rafael. So, first question is a very good one, the relationship between Castellanos' theories and the Cuban Revolution. Because again, we have a changing paradigm, because soon after the revolution, there is this idea in Cuba that we are all brothers. Black and white fought against the empire, and now we are all brothers. But, and this is the beginning of a new era, it's the it's the construction of the Cuban state. But that's where things get interesting, because the same things happen in Italy with the unification. When you build a new state, the elite, which tends to be white, and this was the case in Cuba too, has to reflect on who are we going to include in the new nation, and who are we not going to include. And that's where criminology becomes a very powerful science, an allied science, because it really helps you to say who's a criminal, who's not. So at first in Cuba, we have this idea we are all brothers. And of course, this is not an environment where Castellanos theories could have a role. But then with the construction of a new state, there is this rising tension between the white elite who gains the control and who's building the new state, and the black people who wants to be part of the new construction. They want to be represented in politics. There are tension. There is a black party. And my reading is that at this point, so growing social tensions, at this point, Castellanos theories are very helpful for the white elite to keep the power. Because they say, look, we don't want to give our power to other people. We want to keep, I'm simplifying, of course, but in Castellanos, the science is telling us that these people are criminals. And of course, we can't include them in the nation. So I would say that the relationship between Castellanos and the Cuban Revolution is very tight in the sense that Castellanos theories are a counter way to the Cuban Revolution. So I would say this is very and something that I didn't mention in my presentation. So as Aide also said, so Ortiz writes a book on los negros brujos, y Castellanos writes the same thing. He writes on the brujeria. What I didn't say is that in those years, there was a sort of public hysteria about brujeria. Because actually, there is this very famous case in 1904, La Niña Sola. So the body of a white girl who was very young, blonde, white, and that's a very true story. Her body was found horribly mutilated. And so they found out that she had been killed in a ritual, kind of black magic ritual. And this triggers a reaction from the public opinion. So it's a kind of witchcraft, witch hunt. And of course, who are the bad people are the black people. And there are more than 40 trials those years. Black people accused of being brujos, and most of them end up in people not being convicted. So these are false accusations. But this is to say that, of course, the idea of brujeria has been used by the white elite to kind of criminalize the population and also to divide people. And that's where Castellanos theories become important. So, of course, science never happens in a vacuum. There are many factors at play. And of course, Castellanos theories must be read against the background of the Cuban Revolution, the struggle of black people to be included in the political power. And that's my answer to that first question. As for Ribeiro, what's where I think it's the bandit from Brazil, right?
Sí. Cangaceiros.
because if I'm not wrong, cangaceiros were these brigands, right? Brigantes in Brazil. I'm not sure who is referring to. Yes.
Sí, sí, nos puede
I have this
especificar.
kind of memory that it's a group of bandits that were actually exterminated in the 40s. Can you say it again? Because I don't have internet. I just want to check it out. Oh yeah. So that's what I was thinking about. Yes, that's interesting because that's a. So the relationship. So Ribeiro does not study. So these cangaceiros are bandits in rural Brazil. And they were really a pain for the regime because they were brigands, of course, they were rebels. Ribeiro does not study them, but they are studied because at some point this band is caught by the police and all of them are killed and they are beheaded and their heads are displayed. There is a picture, but we can perhaps show later on. They are beheaded and all their heads are exposed and they are brought to the Museum of Anthropology in Brazil, I don't remember which one, where they are studied by a forensic doctor who was, of course, not a direct disciple, but who was an admirer of Cesare Lombroso. So it's not Ribeiro that studied them, but criminal anthropology is still very important in the understanding and study of them. So I don't know if you can see much here, but you can see all these people beheaded. So Lombroso is still there,
La siguiente pregunta de Zoom es de Carlos López Beltrán y dice, ¿nos podrías hablar un poco sobre la circulación de los textos lombrosianos en italiano, francés o español de Europa a América Latina? Y un poco más sobre la circulación de personas asociadas al lombrosismo en ambas direcciones.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for the very good question. So, circulation of text. It's interesting that Lombroso was never translated into Spanish. So the people in Latin America mostly read Lombroso in the French translation. And so that's already interesting in a sense. Text that went from the other side of the ocean to Italy. Well, Fernando Ortiz was very important, Los Negros Brujos. For example, Lombroso wrote the introduction to the book, but even more interesting is the circulation of people. For example, I did mention Raimundo Nina Rodriguez. Rodriguez came to, if I'm not mistaken, came to Italy. Ortiz went to Italy while he was still a student. And he started to write Los Negros Brujos when he was interred at Lombroso's salon in his house. And Raimundo Nina Rodriguez, now I remember, he had to visit Lombroso, but he died before he could. On the other hand, there's a book that's very recently on the Lombrosian school in Latin America. In the 20s, Gina Lombroso was Cesare Lombroso's daughter, and her husband, which is Guillermo Ferrero. And by the way, Guillermo Ferrero wrote with Lombroso the Criminal Woman, so this very misogynistic treatise. They went to Latin America. They spent months in Brazil, Argentina, some other countries. Paid by everything was sponsored by the governments, going to luxury hotels, having luxury. So a kind of superstar way of treating them. And Enrico Ferri was also one of the disciples of Lombroso. Same story. He went on a conference tour in Latin America. And the way these people were received by the elite, in sense of the hotel they went to, the food they eat, but also from the public, was amazing, was really unbelievable for the time. Just to give an example, at some point in Brazil, there is a public debate because the government paid too much, according to public opinion, they spent too much money for the Ferrero and Lombroso couple. So there is this circulation of people, which is very interesting, I would say. And Ribeiro, on the other hand, went to Italy. So indeed, there is a circulation of text and circulation of people. And what I would like to stress is that it's not just from Europe it's not just from the center to the peripheries, but it's also the other way. So actually the Lombrosian used all these texts written by Ribeiro, by Castellanos, to kind of show that the Lombroso legacy was still very strong. So I think, to sum up, that there was a mutual advantage. So on the one hand, for example, with the Lombroso Prize, on the one hand, these scientific peripheries could say, well, look, Italy, the cradle of Lombroso is saying that we are doing great. On the other hand, people in Italy could say, look, even in the peripheries, people are reading. So this, I think, exactly, mutual, exactamente. And so this is...
Tenemos dos preguntas más de YouTube. La primera la hace Roberto Acevedo y dice, a mí me gustaría saber en qué se enfocaron los análisis para afirmar que las mujeres en Cuba resistían a su predisposición violenta. Saber un poco más de esto.
So on what basis they found out this, right? So it's the statistics. So what Castellanos does, he is head of the Institute of Identification. The Institute of Identification is the place where people, criminal suspects or people sentenced by a judge, go to take pictures, take their fingerprints, register all the data. And of course, there is an archive, and Castellanos has access to all these archives, to all these data. And by looking at the statistics, he starts to compare men with women, and he also uses other statistics, second-hand statistics brought by other people in Spain, in Argentina, Uruguay, and he kind of makes this comparison. And on the basis of this comparison, he claims that there is this resistance. But this is very Lombrosian of Castellanos, because Lombroso was the king of taking just the statistics that were good for him, take aside all the rest, and also to use second-hand, third-hand sources to kind of confirm his theories. And I think that Castellanos did exactly that. We already said that Castellanos writes this book in a very precise moment of Cuban history. What a surprise when he finds out that women are good at, they are entitled to vote, and that the book is dedicated to Machado, and he's paid, he takes his money from Machado. So, of course, but the way he finds out this, in principle, is by comparing statistics. Yes.
Y bueno, un último comentario de Sebastián Herrera. Dice, en realidad las nociones lombrosianas fueron aclimatadas a México de forma muy heterodoxa. Por ejemplo, si hubo gabinetes antropométricos en algunas penitenciarías como Puebla, o bien se implementó el sistema Bertillon, la fotografía de frente y de perfil en la penitenciaría de Jalisco. El Código Penal decimonónico fue todavía liberal, más en el sentido de becaria. Las nociones biologicistas se vertieron en el Código Penal mexicano hasta 1931 con el Código Almaraz, pero no tomaba a las nociones lombrosianas clásicas y hacía una aclimatación variada. Es como que su comentario, si tuvieras algo que decir.
I totally agree. It's misleading to think that a country was Lombrosian or not. Things are more complicated, as I tried to show. In Italy, it's the same. So when we assess the legacy of a scientist, for example, of Lombroso, there are many factors that we should take into account. For example, in Italy too, the theories of Lombroso did not shape the criminal code. El Código Penal Italiano, even if Lombroso was very important, was not very much influenced by Lombroso. But if we look at the practice, at the everyday practice, if we look at institutions outside the law, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, scientific police, there we can see that the influence is still at play. But I know that in Mexico, Lombroso was kind of not as influential as he was in other. So I think I know what text he's referring to, but I totally agree with it. So that's correct. Thank you.
Una participación más acá.
No sé si hay otras preguntas.
Bueno, yo más que hacer preguntas, quiero pues agradecer, ¿no? a Aide y a Franco por venir a México. Y Aide, muy buen comentario, muy inspiring, como dicen. Y bueno, solamente no tengo muchos cuestionamientos que podemos seguir elaborando. Em, eh, También para anunciarle al público en general, a los interesados, que en enero, entre enero y febrero, vamos a tener otro profesor del Museo Lombroso, Silvano Montaldo, que también está muy interesado en la presencia del Lombrosian en las Américas, ¿no? Y bueno, que to be continued con la discusión.
Claro.
Y simplemente dejar planteado, Franco, recuperar la idea de Aide sobre la observación. Y yo creo que un elemento fundamental que constituyó las observaciones fue justamente la generación de datos estadísticos y que habría que ponerlos en discusión con la observación del cuerpo, ya sea endocrino, que derivó de los laboratorios o a nivel de las dimensiones corporales, ¿no? Y pensar cómo de datos no, como tú decías, misleading, o sea, y no probados, se generaron disciplinas experimentales y la estadística misma, ¿no? Que será, que es muy interesante, estaba yo pensando en Gini, que es otro italiano que vendrá mucho después y que constituirá como un giro sobre la medición estadística y que fortalecerá nuestra idea de la estadística como una ciencia. Entonces, hay continuación en esto, ¿no? Y bueno, que es un tema para reflexionar, qué es medir y cómo contribuyen estas mediciones no profesionales, amateurs, en, en las mediciones, ¿no? Para pensar también cómo se conoce y qué es la ciencia. En los dos lados, en Europa y en América, ¿no? Pues no sé si haya más preguntas en línea, ¿no? Pues agradecerles a todos ustedes su presencia, su entusiasmo, y pues esperando vernos pronto, ver nuestras investigaciones. Gracias, gracias.
Gracias.